Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Diaz and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap. Recent headlines have been dominated by a potential 25% tariff threat on all Canadian exports. But rather than talk specifics about something that may not happen, this week we're going to talk about Canada's relationship with the US and what could be behind the latest tariff threat. So is Canada already the 51st state? No, of course not. The suggestion that Canada should be annexed and become a state is outrageous, but obviously made to provoke, and I, for one, am disappointed and frankly a little embarrassed our politicians took the bait. However, there are some grounds on which this idea has been debated, often reflecting cultural, economic, and political ties between Canada and the United States. First is the obvious cultural overlap. Canadians consume a ton of American media, and many Canadian artists and hockey players operate primarily within the U.S., further blurring these cultural distinctions. And then there is the similar lifestyles like urban development and suburban living, and of course the consumer culture that we share. And for all the bloviating in Ottawa and the media over Trump's claim, the leading candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada chose an American TV show to soft launch his leadership campaign. Ironic. Anyway, politics bore me, so let's talk about the huge economic integration that exists between the two countries with the longest unsecured border in the world. The U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner, and where Canada sends 75% of its goods. And for many U.S. states, Canada is their biggest client. This is because proximity matters, and you can bet they are not in favor of tariffs, no matter what they might be saying publicly. Tariffs are paid by the importer, and this would cost Americans billions of dollars. Furthermore, the nature of the U.S. trade deficit with Canada is also why we remain so sanguine with respect to the tariff threats. The U.S. sells Canada billions worth of goods and services and buys Canadian oil. This is because even though the U.S. is the largest producer of oil in the world and no longer has an oil deficit, not all oil is created equal. The U.S. produces lighter, sweet crude, and they have to import heavy crude. This is exactly the type of oil that Canada has in spades. And then the nearly 4.5 million barrels of oil per day that Canada produces is transported via an extensive pipeline network to the major refineries in the Midwest that are specifically designed to process this oil into useful products. For the U.S. to replace this with imports from other countries is nearly impossible and would destabilize key economic infrastructure and the finely tuned oil market. Canadian and American companies are also heavily integrated with frequent cross-border mergers and investment, and it is increasingly the case. The U.S. is the main destination for Canadian direct investment abroad, with 50% of all holdings, and about the same for U.S. as the primary investor of foreign direct investment into Canada. There's also major regulatory overlap. One example is the U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council, which brings together regulators from both the U.S. and Canada to reduce unnecessary differences in their regulatory regimes. It covers a wide range of products across several key sectors: agriculture, food, transportation, health, personal care, workplace chemicals, everything from plugs to pills. Another more specific example is when Canada worked with California to lower vehicle emissions. The relative ease with which Canadians can travel to and from America also reflects the close ties of the two countries. The countries cooperate on crime, border control, maritime regulation. It goes on and on. The truth is that Canada and the U.S. reflect what we see in Europe, countries which have given up sovereignty over rulemaking in exchange for ease of doing business and the obvious economic benefits. The hand-wringing over the U.S. tariff threat also rings hollow because within Canada there is hardly a free market. Interprovincial tariffs or non-geographic trade barriers are nearly 20% versus those same provinces and the U.S. This is madness. It's sometimes cheaper for provinces to trade with the U.S. than within Canada, and addressing this would go a long way to dealing with Canada's productivity emergency. But of course, special interest groups in each provinces would fight hard to protect their little fiefdoms, so this is a lot easier said than done. As investment managers, it's crucial to think more deeply about an issue rather than taking it at face value. This tariff talk is ripe for lifting the lid on the relationship Canada has with the U.S. and the strategic objectives of the Trump administration, and the part Canada will necessarily play in it, and what the tariff talk is ultimately about. We outlined in our 5 themes for 2025 the heightened risk of global conflict. With the peace through strength doctrine, there will be a renewed emphasis on the military, and harking back to Trump 1.0 is the view that the allies of the U.S., like Canada, are not doing their fair share. Looking at the numbers, it is hard to disagree. It's been 30 years since Canada has met its NATO commitments, and although Canada and the West will continue to free ride off of the U.S. security guarantee, this lack of commitment is starting to have some political consequences, the first of which is in the Arctic. Canada is increasingly seen as a soft target in the Arctic, and if and when the ice melts away, it will be a growing point of emphasis for the U.S. as they work to ensure the security of their northern flank. This is not new. There has been growing tensions between Canada, NATO, and the U.S. circa the Arctic for years. The Biden administration kept key Trump policies to enhance American military and civilian capabilities to operate in the harsh Arctic climate, and Biden embraced the policy to strengthen NATO naval capabilities and the protection of the U.S. airspace in Alaska. The main difference here, as always with Trump, is a question of tone, but fundamentally not much has changed. Canadians may not want to hear this, but as investment managers, it is crucial to take emotion out of it and see the world as it is, where the risks to our portfolios lie, as well as the opportunities. Connecting defense, the Arctic, and Canada are rare earth elements. These are a group of elements that are essential components in advanced technologies like electronics, renewable energy systems, and defense equipment. And our modern life is essentially impossible without them. And guess what? Canada has some of the largest known reserves and resources of rare earths in the world. To give you a small example, Canada has 3% of the world's cobalt reserves, 2.5% of lithium, and 0.7% of known reserves for nickel, copper, magnesium, graphite, and other rare earths. This is 53 times less than China. However, as of today, China accounts for 63% of the world's rare earth mining, 85% of the processing, and 92% of rare earth magnetic production. This is because rare earth processing is very dirty and it takes up a lot of energy. And this allowed China, with its laxer regulations and much cheaper workforce, to outcompete Canada, where it is no longer competitive to mine and refine the minerals. This will have to change because rare earth alloys and magnets that China controls are critical components to missiles, firearms, radars, stealth aircraft, and ultimately the US and Europe are putting more and more pressure to open mines and create a new supply chain. So as the Trump tariff talks heat up, we hope you keep in mind the nature of the relationship between Canada and the US and what might be behind the bluster, as well as the risks to portfolios that are not being talked about, like more cuts to corporate taxes and deregulation, which will make the U.S. an even better destination for global capital than it already is. This might have knock-on effects for capital markets and further destabilize Europe, which is committed to manage decline and sacrificing industrial base on the altar of climate change. All right, so that's a wrap on this week's episode. Thanks again for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. And as always, we manage money for families all across Canada and the world, so feel free to get in touch.